The look on her face when the sheriff's deputy handed her the folded piece of paper is something I will carry with me until the day I die, because for the first time in 11 years, Deborah Whitfield had absolutely nothing to say. 31 people stood frozen around that backyard, plates of potato salad still in their hands, and my mother-in-law, the woman who built her entire identity around controlling every square inch of her son's life, stood there reading an eviction notice with her mouth hanging open while her own daughter refused to even look at her. 6 months earlier, if you had told me I would be the one standing in that yard watching her world collapse, I would have laughed at you, because 6 months earlier I was still convinced that if I just tried harder, if I just smiled wider and bit my tongue one more time, she would eventually let me in. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was never wrong about her. My name is Rachel Doyle, I'm 42 years old, and I live just outside Asheville, North Carolina, in a quiet neighborhood full of dogwood trees and neighbors who actually wave when you drive by. If you're new here, welcome to Silent Revenge Stories, the place where women like me finally get to tell the truth about the families that tried to break us. And if this story pulls you in the way I think it will, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because I promise you, by the end of this, you are going to want to be here for what comes next. I've been married to my husband Grant for 11 years. We have 2 kids, Owen who's 9, and Maddie who just turned 6, and for the first 3 years of our marriage, I genuinely believed that the coldness I felt from Grant's mother was something I could fix with patience. I baked her banana bread every single Sunday for 2 years. I remembered every one of her doctor's appointments before she did. I drove 40 minutes each way just to sit with her when she had her gallbladder removed, and she thanked me by telling the nurse I was just the daughter-in-law, not really family. That phrase, not really family, became the quiet soundtrack of my entire marriage. Deborah never screamed it at me. She was far too strategic for that. Instead, she said it in small, surgical cuts, in front of just enough people to humiliate me but never enough to make Grant feel obligated to defend me. She'd introduce me at church as Grant's wife, while introducing her actual daughter Kayla's husband as my son. She'd plan family vacations and mention them casually at dinner, only for me to realize weeks later that Owen and Maddie had been invited and we hadn't. When I confronted Grant about it, he'd sigh and say the same thing every time, "That's just how she is, don't take it personally," as if there was some version of that sentence that wasn't personal when it was aimed directly at my children. The turning point, the one that set everything in motion, happened on a Thursday afternoon that started like any other. I remember because it was Owen's school pickup day and I had exactly 11 minutes to get from Deborah's house back to the elementary school, which is the only reason I was even there in the first place, dropping off a container of soup because she'd texted Grant claiming she had the flu. I walked into her kitchen unannounced, the way family does, and found her sitting at the table with her sister Pam and a folder full of paperwork spread out between them. When she saw me, she didn't even try to hide it. She just looked up, almost bored, and said, "Oh good, Rachel's here, maybe she can hear this too, since she's going to find out eventually anyway." Pam looked uncomfortable. Deborah did not. She told me, calm as anything, that she had spoken to an estate attorney about restructuring the family trust, the one that included the lake house in Highlands that Grant's late father had built with his own hands, and that she was recommending Grant's inheritance be placed in a trust that excluded me entirely, for protection, in case our marriage ever fell apart. Then she looked me dead in the eye and said the sentence that changed everything. "I love you, Rachel, I really do, but you need to understand something. You will never truly belong in this family. Blood is blood." I said, I already knew that. And I meant it in a way she couldn't possibly have understood in that moment, because what she didn't know was that I had known exactly what she thought of me for years, and I had been quietly preparing for this exact conversation the entire time. Here's what Deborah Whitfield never bothered to learn about me in 11 years of marriage. Before I met Grant, I spent 6 years working as a paralegal for a family law and estate planning firm in Charlotte. I know how trusts work. I know how deeds work. I know exactly what documents matter and exactly which ones people forget about until it's too late. And I knew something Deborah had apparently forgotten entirely, buried under years of assuming I was too soft, too accommodating, too eager to please to ever push back. For years earlier, when Grant's father passed away suddenly from a heart attack, the estate had been a mess, split between an old will that hadn't been updated since 2003 and a mountain of unresolved debt from a failed business venture Deborah had talked him into. Grant, drowning in grief and paperwork he didn't understand, had asked me to help sort through it, because he trusted me with the one thing his mother never had, competence under pressure. I had spent 3 exhausting months untangling that estate, and in the process, in order to protect the family from creditors going after the lake house directly, I had restructured the property title myself, with a real estate attorney I trusted, into a joint ownership arrangement between Grant and me specifically, not the family trust Deborah assumed still controlled it. She had been so consumed with her grief and her control over the funeral arrangements that she never once asked to see the final paperwork. She simply assumed the house still belonged to the family, meaning her. It did not. I said nothing that day in her kitchen. I smiled, I told her I hoped she felt better soon, and I drove to get Owen from school with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from something closer to clarity. That night, I didn't say a single word to Grant about what his mother had said, because I needed to see how far this would go, and because some battles you don't win by reacting in the moment, you win by watching quietly and letting people show you exactly who they are when they think no one's paying attention. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things I had spent years explaining away. Deborah began hosting what she called, just the real family, dinners on Sunday nights, technically inviting Grant but conveniently scheduling them during Maddie's dance recitals or Owen's baseball games, events she knew I couldn't miss. When Grant's sister Kayla got engaged, Deborah threw an engagement party and handed out physical invitations to everyone in the extended family except us, then acted shocked and hurt when I mentioned we hadn't received one, insisting it must have been a mailing mistake, even though our address hadn't changed in 8 years. Then came the moment that really opened my eyes to how deep this went. In late March, Grant came home from visiting his mother looking pale and unsettled. He sat me down at our kitchen table and told me Deborah had informed him, very casually, over coffee, that she was thinking about using part of her retirement savings to help Kayla and her fiancé buy their first house, and that she wanted Grant to understand that when she passed, the lake house and whatever remained of the estate would be split with that in mind, meaning Kayla would get significantly more to balance things out. Grant, to his credit, was upset about the unfairness of it, but he still framed it as his mother simply favoring her daughter, a preference, nothing more. I asked him one simple question. I asked him whether his mother had ever mentioned anything about the deed to the lake house specifically, whether she still believed it belonged to the family trust. He said yes, she'd brought it up, saying something about how, when the time comes, the house needs to stay in the family the right way. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to wait quietly anymore, because Deborah wasn't just trying to hurt my feelings, she was actively planning to rewrite the future of my children's inheritance based on a lie she'd been telling herself for 4 years, and she was doing it without ever once asking Grant, her own son, whether the paperwork even said what she assumed it said. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because I know a lot of you watching this have lived some version of what I'm describing. The hardest part of dealing with a toxic mother-in-law isn't the insults. It's the way she makes you question whether you're overreacting, whether you're the problem, whether family is supposed to feel this exhausting. For 4 years I told myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself that if I could just prove I was worthy, patient enough, generous enough, quiet enough, she would eventually soften. What I finally understood in that kitchen was that Deborah didn't dislike me because of anything I had done wrong. She disliked me because I represented something she couldn't control, and control was the only language she had ever known how to speak in that family. Understanding that changed the entire way I approached what came next, because I stopped trying to earn her approval and started protecting what actually mattered: my marriage, my children, and the truth. For the next 2 months, I did something I had never done before in 11 years of marriage. I started quietly documenting everything. Every excluded event, every backhanded comment, every screenshot of a group text where Deborah had accidentally left us off the invite list for Easter. I wasn't building a case out of spite. I was building a record, because I had learned in my paralegal days that people like Deborah rely entirely on nobody keeping score, on everyone being too polite or too exhausted to push back when it finally matters. I also did something that terrified me more than anything else. I finally sat Grant down and told him everything: the kitchen conversation, the trust comment, all of it, laid out calmly with dates and details instead of emotion. I watched something shift in my husband's face that night, a kind of quiet, devastating clarity, the look of a man realizing his mother had been quietly trying to erase his wife from his own family's future for years while he'd been telling himself it was nothing. Grant didn't explode. He didn't call his mother screaming. Instead, he did something far more effective. He asked me to pull the actual property paperwork on the lake house, the real deed, the one Deborah had never bothered to look at, and when he saw his own name listed alongside mine, jointly, with no trust involved whatsoever, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long, long time. Then he looked at me and said, "She's been planning to give away a house that isn't even hers to give." That sentence became the quiet turning point of everything that followed, because for the first time in our marriage, Grant wasn't trying to soften his mother's behavior for my sake. He was angry, and not at me. We decided together, calmly and deliberately, that we weren't going to confront Deborah privately, because privately was exactly where she felt safest, exactly where she could deny, deflect, and rewrite the story afterward the way she always did. We decided the truth needed to come out somewhere she couldn't control the narrative, somewhere her audience, her precious sense of being the matriarch everyone admired, was actually watching. That opportunity came in the form of Kayla's engagement party redo, a big backyard celebration Deborah insisted on hosting herself 2 months later, inviting what felt like half the county specifically to show off how generous and put together the Whitfield family was. This time, Grant made sure we were invited, loudly and publicly, by simply showing up, because it was, after all, still legally his father's house and his family too, whether his mother liked it or not. I want to tell you honestly, walking into that backyard that day, I felt calmer than I had in years. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't rehearsing apologies in my head the way I used to before every family event. I had spent months feeling small in that family, and I walked in that day knowing exactly what I was holding. The party went on pleasantly enough for the first hour: string lights, a caterer, Deborah in her element holding court near the dessert table, telling everyone within earshot how blessed she felt to watch her real family grow. And then Kayla, sweet, oblivious Kayla, made an offhand comment thanking her mother for promising to help fund the down payment on their new house, using proceeds from the lake house eventually, and just like that, the door I'd been waiting for swung wide open in front of 31 witnesses. Grant didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, clearly and calmly, "Mom, what exactly do you mean by proceeds from the lake house?" Deborah, sensing an audience, doubled down instantly, launching into her familiar script about family loyalty and blood staying together and how the house needed to eventually go where it belonged. That's when I stepped forward, and for the first time in 11 years, I didn't shrink. I told her, gently but firmly, in front of everyone, that the lake house had not belonged to the family trust for 4 years, that it was jointly owned by Grant and me since the estate was settled, and that legally, she had no authority whatsoever to promise it, sell it, or divide its value among anyone. I watched 31 faces turn toward her, watched the color drain from her cheeks as she realized every single person she'd spent years performing generosity for was now watching her scramble for an explanation that didn't exist. She tried to spin it, of course, insisting there had been some paperwork mix-up, that Grant would obviously make things right, for his sister regardless. But Grant, standing beside me, said the words I will never forget for the rest of my life. He told his mother that he loved her, but that he would not be pressured into giving away part of his children's future to correct a lie she had been telling herself and everyone else for 4 years. And that if she ever again told anyone that his wife wasn't really family, she wouldn't be welcome in his home again. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever heard. That should have been enough, honestly, and for most people, it would have been. But Deborah, being Deborah, couldn't let it go quietly, and 2 weeks later she made her final mistake. She showed up unannounced at the lake house while we were there for a weekend with the kids, let herself in using a spare key she still had from years earlier, and informed us she was moving some of her late husband's belongings out of the garage, before things got complicated, essentially trying to physically claim territory in a house she legally had no ownership over. That's when I made the call I'd been quietly preparing for weeks. I contacted the same property attorney who had helped me restructure the deed years earlier, and we had formal legal documentation drawn up, clarifying and notifying, in writing, that Deborah Whitfield had no legal claim, access rights, or ownership interest in the property whatsoever, and that any further unauthorized entry would be treated as trespassing. Which brings us back to that backyard, months later, at Owen's 9th birthday party, of all places, the day the sheriff's deputy calmly handed Deborah that folded notice after she once again let herself onto the property uninvited to supervise the grill, as she put it, in front of every relative who had also been at that engagement party and heard exactly what had already been said. She stood there, reading it, humiliated in a way words truly cannot capture, and this time, nobody rushed to defend her. Not Kayla, who quietly told her later that week she needed to stop making everything so hard. Not the aunts and cousins who had spent years watching her quietly diminish me and said nothing until they finally saw the paperwork for themselves. Grant simply walked over, took the notice gently from her hands, and told her she was welcome to stay for cake, as a guest, like everyone else, if she could act like one. She left without saying a word. In the months since, something has genuinely shifted in our family, not out of punishment, but out of finally establishing the boundaries I should have set on day one. Deborah still sees Owen and Maddie. She still comes to birthdays and holidays, but she comes as a guest now, not as a general issuing orders in a war she started. Grant checks in with me before every family decision now, not because he has to, but because he finally understands what it cost me to stay quiet for so long. And me, I finally feel like what I always was, whether Deborah wanted to admit it or not, which is exactly, completely, undeniably family. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever felt like an outsider in your own home the way I did for years, subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories right now so you don't miss the next one, and leave a comment below telling me the one lesson you're taking from this, because I read every single one, and I promise you, your story matters just as much as mine does.